This is a Ryobi P580 tile saw. It's one of the newer items from Ryobi. It's part of their lithium-ion themed product line of cordless power tools. Runs on their 18-volt 1+ system. Also backward compatible to their NiCad stuff. This saw works as a tile saw, pretty much tile saw only. It's very similar in construction to their wood saws, and I'm going to do a little snippet on their wood saws so you can see for comparison, and then we'll get back to you. This is the Ryobi P506. It's the one with the laser. The laser, I believe, has its own switch. I'm not certain. But we can see how the shoe is pretty close to the older model. All the same adjustments. If you buy this as a separate item, you also get the little kicker for doing voids. The 504G is basically the exact same thing, but without the laser. If you look at the way the laser, the housing is designed, the housing actually is entirely different for the laser. So that's what the difference is. And generally speaking, the 504 is a standalone unit. The 506 is quite often something that you get as part of a kit. As far as our comparison with the tile saw goes, this saw is definitely lighter weight. The shoe is, or the little foot shoe type thing here is lighter. And of course these have the guard, and they take a standard small saw blade, I think 5 1/4, something like that. The other thing, just like on the 504G, the Allen wrench is on the saw, and of course it's right here. And very much like the tile saw, it's reverse threaded so that these things can kind of tighten themselves a little bit as the saw's running. The switch assembly and everything is pretty close to the same, except that you'll notice that the little bit more deluxe model has a little bit more of the compound molding on the handle. So if you look at these from a distance, you'll see the handle is slightly different. As far as the motors go, 99.9% certain that the motors are the same. And because on the 506, 504 series, the battery mounts to the side, the balance on the saw is a little bit different. A lot of people consider it an improvement. I'm not sure if there's a huge difference between the two, but it does place a little more weight closer to the center of gravity on a saw. The tile saw, of course, is based on this platform, but over here, the entire blade assembly and mounting area is different, the shoe is different, and the tile saw is much heavier. Okay, so back from the store, where you got to see how the newer generation of wood saws are introduced into the Ryobi product line, using the same basic motor head assembly, same basic handle assembly. You can see as we compare to the other two wood saws how they kind of mix and match a couple little things in the composite handles and the motor assembly to come out with the tile saw. As the entire assembly replaces the older blue body tool, which is really not half bad, but got a bad reputation because of the weak batteries that they were usually packaged with. Again, if you use one of these with the new style batteries, especially the P108 batteries, these are not half bad. But one of the things I began to notice in my comparison is there are compatibility issues between the new and the old stuff. Fortunately, they've managed to keep the same basic Allen keys for replacing the blades. So let's say we pull the Allen key off the older model, it also fits the newer model. The other thing is they've become relatively standardized with, let's say you've got one of these little Job Max multi-tools. Again, these heads are compatible also across the rigid product line. It takes the same basic Allen wrench, so if you keep any of these tools around, you're probably going to have a couple of these Allen wrenches handy. Here on these saws though, especially on the newer models, that's reverse threaded, and I found that it's actually reverse threaded on all of the new models. And again, we've got onboard storage for the tool with this saw. What makes the tile saw different is not just the blade holding assembly, although it looked to me after extensive comparison that the motor body and all of that is basically coming off the same assembly line, uses a lot of the same parts. The shoe, foot, bottom plate assembly, whatever you want to call it, is larger on a tile saw. Although when we look at the opening here, I really was under the impression that this was also going to be used on a wood cutting saw, but apparently that's not the case. And the newer style wood saws still are not using this larger foot. Although I would strongly suspect, because of where the mounting points are on some of this, that you may be able to retrofit or deal with some compatibility on this. The other thing is that this is made to accept the little Outrigger attachment, but the Outrigger attachment is not included, although on the older models it was included. And from what I can tell from looking at it, if you have one of these little Outrigger attachments, they are compatible. One of the benefits you're going to get, though, is that with this little raised lip on both sides, if you're going to use the little board and clamp method to have something to trace with, you can simply trace your line along here, as long as you get your measurements set up right. They have a pretty good clear cutting guide with the contrasting colors. Part of the reason for making that a contrasting color is it's part of the quality increase on Ryobi tools. Again, compared to the others, they had a pretty hard to read little graph, although there's some ways you could simply modify and mark that a little bit better. Part of the overall quality improvement with the Ryobi tools over the last several years. And it's decent, you know. This stuff, it's a little bit thicker metal than they used to use. But the other thing is, whenever you're using a wet saw, you're going to get dust and junk and mud kind of all over the place. These are not a tool that's going to stay clean once it's put into use. So you've got that. We've got some angle and bevel adjustments here. Because that's only a 4-inch blade, we're not going to have a whole lot of range of depth adjustment. In fact, the way this thing is set right now, that's really about as much depth adjustment as we get. And when I run this all the way up to, you know, what they claim to be 0, we're already not touching. So it's obvious that this head assembly had originally, a lot of the parts on this had originally been intended for a larger blade, but this is basically the modification to make this a tile cutting saw. Instead of putting a larger diameter tile cutting blade in one of these things and then running into horsepower issues. This is a 4-inch blade. If I'm not mistaken, this is a 4.5-inch blade. This is what I normally would use on a grinder that I'm going to use for trimming bricks or rocks on brick or masonry work, where the particular job calls for cutting a brick or trimming a brick. The little holes here you'll see are partly for clearing debris and keeping the blade from heating up, especially in the situations where it's not a water-cooled blade. Although what some guys will do is they keep a little tub of water or something nearby to kind of run a blade through it to cool it down. What you'll end up is some rust issues and the risk of getting water splashed into your motor mechanism. This saw, of course, is made to work around water. And although the saw itself will work with, it'll work wet or dry, it comes included with one cutting wheel, and they say it's wet only. You know what? I don't think it's going to totally self-destruct if you do, you know, a couple of cuts dry. Kind of your choice on that. The way the water reservoir works here, obviously it's limited capacity. Obviously this isn't an 8-hour-a-day, all-day type of tool for cutting. This is kind of good for the quick in and out, quick trim. And of course with the off-grid use being entirely possible because it's battery operated, what you do is you would fill this with water. It remains sealed pretty well by the little mechanism that's in here. Kind of a little clever engineering. We've got a release button here. You can see how powerful that is. It's almost like a little quick release mechanism. This thing's actually kind of semi-mechanical as far as sealing it goes. And apparently if you want to fill or empty this mechanism, you can also do it like this. But from the looks of things, it was set up to where perhaps you could also do a little tube feed up here. There's some kind of little vent hole and some other things just to make sure you don't cavitate your water flow. It doesn't pump the water. It merely just lets it drip. From what I can tell, there may be some little mechanism in here that helps pump. I don't think it pumps water. I think it just kind of helps the water drip through. You can, with this little lever here, you can turn the water flow on or off. Installation of blade, pretty much using that Ryobi Allen bolt system. There's no real fancy stuff going on there. Just stop the blade and be able to lock it in place so you'll be able to get a good bite with your tool. They've got a little stopper button right here. It's the same basic thing that's on their wood cutting saws. The threads on this, you got to remember though, are reverse threaded. If I'm not mistaken, they were not reverse threaded on their older tools. I just got to double check that thing, and actually, yeah, I think it was reverse threaded on their older tool, and I just replaced the blade on that. We're going to do a little bit more of that thing later. Other than that, controls pretty basic, straightforward. We can do some adjustments on angles. I'm just going to leave this thing totally square. We've got a safety button here that can push in from either side, so it's semi-ambidextrous. Kind of irritating, and a lot of professionals disable these types of safety buttons on their tools because they just get in the way. And on the Ryobi tools, because of the nature of the way this is made, it's a little tricky to disable that. A lot of times you just got to learn to live with it. You got to learn to kind of kick that over with your thumb and then pull the trigger. The offhand handle is kind of nice. You got that composite rubber on there. Overall, the build quality on this is really up to par with just about anybody on the market. The intended price on these was around $100, but with discounting and a lack of popularity on this model, don't be surprised if you find it for under $50 from a discount retailer like Amazon.com. You can order these through your Home Depot store, but they're unlikely to keep it as an in-stock item. Usually you go to the customer service desk and they'll order it for you. If you get the veteran or contractor discounts, they'll apply it to your order and then ship the item to your house. It doesn't come with a battery. As far as I know, these things are not available in a kit. It's a tool only. I would be unlikely to purchase this if I wasn't already kind of married into using the OnePlus tool system. Not something you're going to get as a standalone tool, but if you're working around tile, if you're working off grid, you already have other Ryobi tools that give you a reason to get those batteries, then it's a reasonably good investment because it's an underpriced tool due to the lack of popularity on this particular model. A lot of things, handheld tile cutting saws are not going to be able to do as well as a fixed tile saw like the other tub type that I have in another video. But the tub type saw has setup time, and obviously it's not very portable, not battery operated. But with this, especially for small scale, quick repair type operations or operations where you're just not having to trim a whole lot of tiles, this is a real winner. It cuts down your traveling costs and your traveling issues. But realize you're not going to be chopping bricks with it. You're not going to be cutting super thick stuff. This is about the limit of what you can cut, is about 1 inch thick stuff. But if you need to trim a piece of marble, let's say that's already up, you can do it. But also realize you're going to bump into some issues where the foot on this tool is a lot bigger than the reach of the blade. So if it's up against a wall or a counter or something like that, you need a lot of clearance around this tool to work with that small blade. One of the reasons they did that small blade isn't because it's particularly good for cutting detail, but because this is a limited horsepower tool where if they ran a larger diameter blade, it just wouldn't cut. With a smaller diameter, you're pretty much, you know, it's going to cut with what you're doing within its limitations. And normally, you know, 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch, probably 1/2 inch tile is what you're going to be cutting, or some, you know, the stuff that's a little thin with that. The tricky part is because the foot on this tool is so large, you're going to have a real problem cutting small tiles. So you're probably going to want to have some other cutting options around. You don't want to go to a job site where this is the only way you have available to cut tile. You could run into some small ones where your fingers are just getting too close to that blade, or you're not able to stabilize it enough to cut it. The thing is, if you're trying to trim a large tile without bringing all the big equipment out, you want to do that. But to cut a straight line, you got to look at maybe some edge guides or the little guide off of one of the wood cutting saws. So, although it's a limited use item, it's very well made, much better made than the older generation of Ryobi power tools. It's a good addition if you already have the cordless tool system from these guys. I don't know how long this thing would last, and as soon as I start doing real world testing with this thing, it's definitely not going to look new anymore. It's not a nature of the tool, it's just a nature of that kind of work. You got spraying water and tile dust and all that kind of stuff. So we'll do a follow-up review after I've used it on a couple of jobs, and I'll give my opinions on it then. As it is now, I would say that if you anticipate using one, they're a pretty good deal. It's not a bad risk to go and buy one. I just can't give the highest level of recommendation until I do a lot more personal testing.